June 19th, 1944, 08:30 hours, USS Lexington, Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Alexander Vraciu tightened his oxygen mask against his face and scanned the horizon through the curved plexiglass canopy of his F-6 F-3 Hellcat. The carrier's deck crew had just launched him forth in a division of 4 fighters, catapulting his 9,700-pound aircraft into the humid tropical air with violent acceleration that pressed him deep into his seat. Below, the Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction, its surface catching the early morning sunlight in thousands of brilliant reflections. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the Imperial Japanese Navy's mobile fleet was approaching with 9 aircraft carriers, 5 battleships, and hundreds of aircraft. Admiral Raymond Spruance's Task Force 58 had been waiting for this moment. The entire strategic situation in the Pacific theater hinged on what would happen in the next few hours. Adjusted his throat microphone and listened to the controlled urgency in the voice of the fighter director officer aboard Lexington. Bogies inbound bearing 270, distance 60 miles. Many bogies, estimate raid composition 50+. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. In his right hand, Vraciu felt the familiar grip of the control stick, his thumb resting on the gun button that would trigger 6 Browning M2 machine guns, 3 in each wing, loaded with 2,400 rounds of half-inch ammunition. In 10 months of combat operations, he had destroyed 12 Japanese aircraft. Today would rewrite every assumption the Japanese held about American fighter capabilities and the Grumman F-6F Hellcat that carried him toward battle. The transformation of American naval aviation from the desperate defensive battles of 1942 to the overwhelming offensive power of mid-1944 had occurred with breathtaking speed. The catalyst was not just superior numbers or industrial capacity, though both factors mattered enormously. The catalyst was a single aircraft design that combined brutal effectiveness with remarkable survivability, engineered specifically to exploit every weakness of the Zero fighter that had dominated the Pacific for 2 years. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat represented the culmination of hard-won lessons purchased with the blood of pilots who had fought and often died against Japanese Zeros in obsolete F-4F Wildcats. Roy Grumman's design team on Long Island had studied every combat report from Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal with meticulous attention. They had examined the captured Akutan Zero exhaustively, measuring its performance envelope with precision instruments. They understood exactly what American pilots needed to survive and win. The specifications they delivered exceeded every expectation. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine produced 2,000 horsepower at war emergency power, more than twice the output of the Zero's Nakajima Sakaya engine. Maximum speed reached 380 miles per hour at 17,300 feet altitude. Rate of climb exceeded 3,000 feet per minute under combat conditions with full fuel and ammunition. Service ceiling reached 37,300 feet, but raw performance statistics told only part of the story. What made the Hellcat truly revolutionary was how Grumman's engineers had allocated weight. 212 pounds of armor plate protected the pilot from behind and below. Quarter-inch steel plate formed a protective tub around the cockpit that could stop 20mm cannon shells. Armored glass, 3/4 of an inch thick, protected the windscreen. Self-sealing fuel tanks lined with layers of vulcanized rubber would automatically seal bullet holes within seconds, preventing the catastrophic fires that had destroyed so many Zeros. Redundant hydraulic systems meant control surface damage wouldn't necessarily result in loss of control. Robust structure meant the airframe could absorb tremendous battle damage and continue flying. Pilots could bring home Hellcats with hundreds of bullet holes, damaged control surfaces, dead engines, and still survived to fight another day. The weight penalty for all this protection was significant. The Hellcat weighed 9,223 pounds empty, compared to the Zero's 3,790 pounds. Fully loaded for combat, a Hellcat weighed over 12,000 pounds, nearly twice the Zero's combat weight. Yet the massive Pratt & Whitney engine delivered such overwhelming power that performance remained superior in every category except low-speed turning radius. American tactical doctrine had evolved to exploit these advantages ruthlessly. The old pre-war notion of dogfighting in slow-turning battles had been abandoned as demonstrably suicidal. The new doctrine emphasized energy management, vertical maneuvers, and disciplined teamwork. Hellcat pilots fought in pairs, with lead and wingman protecting each other constantly. They attacked from altitude advantage whenever possible, diving at high speed to achieve surprise. They fired short, concentrated bursts at close range, where the 650 caliber machine guns were devastatingly effective. They never attempted to turn with Zeros at low speed, instead using superior power to zoom climb back to altitude or extend away at high speed. The Yokosuka training manuals captured later in the war revealed that Japanese instructors taught their pilots that American fighters were inferior in maneuverability and could be defeated through superior turning ability. This doctrine had been valid against Wildcats in 1942. Against Hellcats in 1944, it was a death sentence. Alexander Vraciu embodied the new generation of American naval aviators who had been forged in this evolved tactical environment. Born in East Chicago, Indiana, on November 2, 1918, to Romanian immigrant parents, he had grown up during the Great Depression, watching his father operate a small restaurant. The family struggled financially, but young Alex excelled academically and earned admission to DePauw University in Indiana, where he enrolled in the Navy's V-5 Aviation Cadet Program. His flight training began in October 1941 at Naval Air Station Glenview, Illinois, just 2 months before Pearl Harbor transformed the program from peacetime preparation to desperate wartime expansion. Vraciu completed primary training in Boeing Stearman N-2S biplanes, learning basic aerobatics, navigation, and the fundamentals of military flying. He advanced to basic training in Vultee SNV trainers, where instructors evaluated his aptitude for carrier, operations versus multi-engine patrol aircraft. His scores placed him in the top tier. He was selected for advanced carrier training at Naval Air Station Miami, Florida, where he flew SNJ Texans and practiced carrier landings on the USS Wolverine, a converted paddle wheel steamer operating on Lake Michigan, specifically for training carrier qualification. The transformation from civilian college student to combat-ready naval aviator required 14 months of intensive training that compressed years of flying experience into a systematic curriculum. Vraciu demonstrated exceptional aptitude in gunnery training, where student pilots fired at towed targets pulled by other aircraft. His hit rates consistently exceeded class averages. Instructors noted his smooth trigger control, his ability to calculate deflection angles instinctively, and his patience in holding fire until achieving optimal range. In January 1943, freshly commissioned as an ensign and newly qualified for carrier operations, Vraciu reported to Naval Air Station Alameda, California, for assignment to a combat squadron. The Navy assigned him to Fighting Squadron 16, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Paul Bowie, then forming on the East Coast. He flew cross-country to Norfolk, Virginia, where VF-16 was conducting workup training with F-6F Hellcats that had just begun reaching fleet squadrons. The Hellcat was so new that maintenance manuals were still being written. Pilots were discovering capabilities and limitations through direct experience. Vraciu's initial impression of the aircraft was overwhelmingly positive. The cockpit was spacious compared to the cramped Wildcat he had flown during advanced training. Visibility through the bubble canopy was excellent in all directions. The controls felt solid and responsive. The massive engine provided acceleration that seemed impossible for such a heavy aircraft. On June 1, 1943, VF-16 deployed aboard USS Lexington, CVA-16, the new Essex-class carrier commissioned just 4 months earlier as replacement for the original Lexington sunk at Coral Sea. The squadron's pilots averaged fewer than 400 flight hours total time. Many had never seen combat. They were about to receive the most intensive education imaginable. The squadron's first combat operations began in late August 1943 with raids on Marcus Island, a tiny coral atoll 1,000 miles northwest of Wake. The missions were designed as much for training as for strategic impact, allowing inexperienced pilots to experience combat in a relatively low-threat environment. Vraciu flew his first combat mission on August 31st, part of a fighter sweep over the island. Japanese defenses were minimal. No enemy aircraft appeared. Anti-aircraft fire was light and inaccurate. But the experience of catapulting from a carrier deck with a full combat load, flying in formation to a hostile target, seeing tracers and flak bursts for the first time, even without engaging enemy aircraft, transformed theoretical training into visceral reality. The squadron's next operations targeted Wake Island in October, then Rabaul in November. At Rabaul, they encountered serious Japanese resistance for the first time. Zeros from several fighter units scrambled to defend the massive base complex. The sky erupted with aircraft. Vraciu found himself in his first actual dogfight, with Zero fighters flashing past his canopy at combined closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. He remembered his training with crystal clarity. Maintain speed, never turn at low speed, use altitude advantage, work with your wingman. A Zero attempted to turn inside his Hellcat during a climbing turn. Vraciu simply pushed his throttle to war emergency power and extended away, using his superior speed to break contact. The Zero couldn't match his acceleration. He reversed position, dove from above, and fired a 3-second burst from dead astern at 300 yards range. The Zero's thin aluminum skin offered no resistance to 50-caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds traveling at 2,850 feet per second. The fighter exploded in a ball of orange flame. Vraciu's first kill. The adrenaline surge was overwhelming, but there was no time to celebrate. Another Zero was attacking his wingman from the side. Vraciu rolled hard, dove to gain speed, and climbed to position himself behind the Japanese fighter. Another burst, another kill, 2 in one mission. Over the next 7 months, Vraciu's skills developed through constant combat exposure. The squadron operated continuously in the most intense combat zone in the Pacific. They struck Kwajalein in December, supporting amphibious landings. They hit Truk Lagoon in February 1944, attacking what had been considered Japan's impregnable fortress. They bombed Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in preparation for invasion. Each mission brought encounters with Japanese fighters. Vraciu's kill total climbed steadily. 3 aircraft in January, 2 more in February, 4 in March and April. His tactical understanding deepened with each engagement. He learned to read Japanese pilot behavior, anticipating their maneuvers before they executed them. He learned to position himself for optimal firing solutions. He learned when to press an attack and when to disengage and reset. By June 19, 1944, when the Philippine Sea battle began, Vraciu had accumulated 12 confirmed aerial victories and the reputation as one of the squadron's deadliest pilots. But the number that mattered most was his survival. He had flown dozens of combat missions without taking serious damage to his aircraft or himself. Skill kept him alive. Discipline kept him effective. The strategic situation that brought him to this moment on June 19th had been developing for months. American forces advancing across the Central Pacific threatened Japan's defensive perimeter in multiple locations simultaneously. The conquest of the Marshall Islands in February had severed Japanese communications with their garrisons further south. The planned invasion of the Mariana Islands, scheduled to begin on June 15th with landings on Saipan, threatened to cut Japan off from oil supplies in the Dutch East Indies. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, understood that losing the Marianas would be catastrophic. B-29 Superfortress bombers operating from Saipan would bring Tokyo itself within range. The war would come directly to Japan's home islands. This could not be permitted. Toyota activated Operation Eigo, the decisive battle plan that would commit virtually all of Japan's remaining carrier air power in a single massive engagement designed to destroy American naval forces invading the Marianas. The Japanese plan was ambitious, but fundamentally flawed by assumptions that no longer reflected reality. Japanese planners believed their aircraft had superior range and could strike American carriers from distances where American aircraft couldn't effectively retaliate. This was true for Zeros in 1942. It was false for Hellcats in 1944. The Hellcats' range with external drop tanks exceeded 1,200 miles. Japanese planners believed their pilots' superior training and experience would offset American numerical advantages. This had been true in 1942, when Japanese pilots averaged hundreds or thousands of flight hours. In mid-1944, most Japanese carrier pilots had fewer than 100 hours total flight time. Experienced veterans had been systematically killed in attrition warfare over Guadalcanal, Rabaul, New Guinea, and the Marshalls. The replacements were barely trained teenagers who had never seen combat. Japanese planners believed that coordinated attacks by large formations would overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers. This doctrine had worked against limited American forces in 1942. Against the massive Task Force 58, with 15 aircraft carriers operating nearly 900 aircraft, it was suicidal. Most critically, Japanese planners still believed that Zeros remained competitive with American fighters in combat. This belief was approximately 2 years out of date. The Zero had been a formidable aircraft in 1942. By mid-1944, it was obsolete. New variants, like the A6M5, had attempted to address glaring deficiencies by adding minimal armor and thicker wing skins, but these modifications increased weight without fundamentally solving the Zero's vulnerability to concentrated 50 caliber fire. The mobile fleet that approached the Marianas on June 19th consisted of 9 aircraft carriers organized into 3 groups. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded from the fleet carrier Taiho. The fleet included heavy carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, veterans of Pearl Harbor that had somehow survived 3 years of brutal combat. Light carriers Junyo, Hio, Ryuho, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho completed the force. The carriers embarked approximately 430 aircraft total, though only about 373 were operational on the morning of June 19th. The composition was heavily weighted toward attack aircraft, with approximately 143 Zero fighters providing escort and combat air patrol. Japanese doctrine emphasized offensive striking power over defensive protection, a philosophy that made sense when Japanese aircraft dominated. Against Hellcats, it was catastrophic. Admiral Raymond Spruance's task force, 58, vastly outnumbered the Japanese in every category. 7 fleet carriers, Essex, Yorktown, Hornet, Wasp, Bunker Hill, Enterprise, and Lexington. 8 light carriers, Belleau Wood, Bataan, Monterey, Cabot, Cowpens, Langley, Princeton, and San Jacinto. The task force operated approximately 900 aircraft, including roughly 450 Hellcat fighters. The numerical advantage was overwhelming, approximately 3-to-1 in total aircraft and better than 3-to-1 in fighters. But numbers alone don't explain what happened. Quality mattered as much as quantity. American pilots averaged significantly more flight hours than their Japanese counterparts. American aircraft were demonstrably superior in protection and firepower. American tactics emphasized teamwork and energy management over individual aerobatics. American radar provided early warning and precise fighter direction. American radio communication allowed coordinated response to threats. The Japanese had none of these advantages. What they had was courage, determination, and willingness to die for the emperor. These qualities made them dangerous individually, but couldn't overcome systemic disadvantages at fleet level. The first Japanese strike launched at approximately 08:30 on June 19th from carriers operating approximately 300 miles west of the American task force. Raid 1 consisted of 69 aircraft, 45 Zero fighters, escorting 16 torpedo bombers and 8 dive bombers. The formation climbed to altitude and headed east toward the reported position of American carriers. American radar detected them at 09:57, while still 72 miles distant. The fighter direction officer aboard Lexington, Lieutenant Joseph Eggert, studied his scope carefully. The return was massive, indicating a large formation. He began vectoring combat air patrol fighters toward the contact, speaking in the calm, measured tone that characterized professional fighter directors even in crisis situations. Vector 270, Buster. Raid composition estimated 50-plus bandits, Angels 24. Buster meant full throttle, maximum speed. Angels 24 indicated altitude 24,000 feet. Every Hellcat pilot in Task Force 58 had trained for exactly this scenario. Mass raids by Japanese aircraft attacking the carriers. The doctrine was simple. Intercept as far from the carriers as possible. Destroy attacking aircraft before they could reach launching range. Use altitude advantage and superior speed to control every engagement. Vraciu's division was already airborne on routine combat air patrol when the vector came. His division leader, Lieutenant Commander Paul Bowie, acknowledged the fighter director's instructions and turned toward the intercept heading. 4 Hellcats in tight formation, throttles advanced to maximum continuous power, climbed steadily toward optimal altitude. At 15 miles from the estimated contact point, Vraciu spotted them through his canopy. Tiny dots against the brilliant blue sky, growing rapidly larger as the combined closing speed approached 700 miles per hour. He keyed his microphone. Tally-ho, 11 o'clock high, many bogies. Bowie acknowledged. Fighting 16, prepare to engage, check your switches, charge your guns. Vraciu's thumb flicked the gun-charging button. In each wing, 3 Browning M2 machine guns cycled their actions, chambering rounds. His left hand confirmed the gun sight was illuminated. His right hand rested lightly on the stick. His feet positioned themselves naturally on the rudder pedals, every sense heightened to maximum acuity. The Japanese formation was larger than he had expected. Not 50 aircraft, more like 70. They flew in relatively loose formation, not the tight defensive boxes American bombers used. The Zeros flew high cover above the torpedo bombers and dive bombers. Classic Japanese doctrine. Offensive aircraft carried the main striking power. Fighters provided protection but weren't expected to achieve air superiority through dedicated fighter sweeps. Bowie led his division into a slashing attack from above and ahead, using altitude advantage to dictate terms. The 4 Hellcats dove at high speed, building energy. At 400 miles per hour indicated airspeed, Vraciu selected a Zero flying at the edge of the formation. He centered it in his illuminated gun sight, calculated deflection instinctively, and pressed the trigger. All 6 guns erupted simultaneously with a hammering roar that shook the entire aircraft. Tracers arced across the sky in a cone of fire. The Zero staggered as multiple 50 caliber rounds struck its engine, cowling and wing root. Smoke erupted. The fighter rolled inverted and fell away. 1. Vraciu didn't watch it crash. He was already selecting his next target, a Zero attempting to position itself for a deflection shot on his wingman. Vraciu rolled hard right, pulled into a steep climbing turn that grayed his vision at the edges from G-forces, and came out directly behind the Japanese fighter at optimal firing range. Another burst. 2 seconds. The Zero's thin aluminum skin peeled away under the paw. Impact of armor-piercing rounds. The unprotected fuel tanks ignited. The aircraft exploded. 2. The sky was absolute chaos. Dozens of aircraft maneuvering violently in 3 dimensions. Tracers from multiple aircraft creating patterns like deadly geometry. Radio calls overlapping as pilots called out targets and threats. The distinctive bark of 50 caliber guns mixed with the higher-pitched rattle of Japanese 20mm cannon, a torpedo bomber appeared in Vraciu's gun sight, flying straight and level toward the carriers. These aircraft had to be stopped before they reached launching range. He dove on it from above, firing a long burst that walked from tail to cockpit. The torpedo bomber erupted in flames and fell toward the ocean far below, trailing black smoke. 3. More Hellcats were arriving every minute as the fighter director vectored additional combat air patrol divisions toward the engagement. The Japanese formation was being torn apart systematically. Zeros attempted to defend the bombers but were outnumbered and outmatched. For every Hellcat, there seemed to be 3 or 4 Japanese aircraft in various stages of being shot down or desperately evading. Vraciu spotted a Zero, attempting to escape the engagement by diving away at high speed. He followed easily. The Hellcat's superior power-to-weight ratio meant it could match or exceed the Zero's dive speed. At 450 miles per hour, he closed to 200 yards and fired. The Zero pulled up hard, attempting an Immelmann turn. Vraciu followed effortlessly, his aircraft's superior power allowing him to maintain position. Another burst. The Zero's wing folded upward at an unnatural angle and separated from the fuselage. 4. The engagement lasted approximately 20 minutes from first contact to final shots. When it ended, the sky was clear except for scattered debris falling toward the ocean and small oil slicks marking where aircraft had crashed into the water. Of the 69 Japanese aircraft in Raid 1, American pilots claimed 45 destroyed. Post-action analysis confirmed at least 42 actually destroyed, with most of the remainder damaged and unable to make it back to their carriers. American losses were minimal, 2 Hellcats damaged. 0 pilots killed. The kill ratio exceeded 20-1. This wasn't combat, it was systematic destruction. Vraciu's aircraft was undamaged, his fuel state was good. His ammunition load was reduced but adequate for another engagement. The fighter director vectored his division back to the task force for combat air patrol duty, while other fighters pursued stragglers. But the Japanese weren't finished. Admiral Ozawa had launched 4 massive raids throughout the day. Raid 2 departed at 08:56 with 128 aircraft. Raid 3 launched at 10 hours with 47 aircraft. Raid 4 followed at 11 hours with 82 aircraft. Total commitment was 326 aircraft, virtually the entire operational strength of the mobile fleet. Every raid met the same fate. Hellcats intercepted them far from the carriers. Superior tactics and aircraft performance turned each engagement into a one-sided slaughter. Japanese pilots fought with desperate courage but couldn't overcome fundamental disadvantages in training, equipment, and doctrine. Raid 2 lost 98 of 128 aircraft. Raid 3 lost 7 of 47. Raid 4 lost 73 of 82. By the end of the day, approximately 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed for the loss of approximately 30 American aircraft. The kill ratio approached 10-1 across all engagements. American pilots would later call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese survivors called it a nightmare. For Alexander Vraciu, the defining moment came during the mid-afternoon engagement with elements of Raid 2 that had bypassed the initial American donut, fighter screen. The fighter director's voice crackled in his headset with unusual urgency. Bogies bearing 265, distance 40 miles, altitude 10,000, many bandits. Vraciu's division turned immediately toward the intercept vector. They spotted the formation at 25 miles. A large group of Japanese aircraft, predominantly Judy dive bombers with Zero escorts, heading directly toward the carriers at relatively low altitude. Lieutenant Commander Bui assessed the situation quickly. The Japanese had deliberately flown low to avoid the high-altitude combat air patrol, hoping to penetrate to launching range. Classic Japanese tactic. Clever but predictable. Bui ordered his division to attack immediately, not waiting for additional fighters to join. 4 Hellcats against approximately 50 Japanese aircraft. The odds seemed impossible, but doctrine emphasized aggressive action. Destroy attacking aircraft immediately. Don't wait. Every second delayed allowed them closer to the carriers. The division dove from altitude, building tremendous speed. Vraciu's indicated airspeed passed 400 miles per hour as the Hellcat plunged toward the Japanese formation. At 3,000 feet, he pulled out of the dive with violent G-forces that compressed his body into the seat and grayed his peripheral vision. He found himself perfectly positioned ahead and above the Japanese formation. Altitude advantage, speed advantage, positional advantage. Everything doctrine emphasized. The first target materialized in his gun sight. A Judy dive bomber flying straight toward him at closing speed exceeding 600 miles per hour. A Judy dive bomber flying straight toward him at closing speed exceeding 600 miles per hour. In combat, time distorts. What actually takes seconds feels like minutes as the mind accelerates into hyper-awareness. Vraciu saw every detail with crystalline clarity. The bomber's distinctive profile with its greenhouse canopy, the three-man crew visible inside, the bomb slung beneath the fuselage, the Hinamaru roundel on the wing. He centered the illuminated reticle of his gun sight on the bomber's engine cowling and pressed the trigger. The Hellcat shuddered as all 6 guns fired simultaneously. 50 caliber rounds converged at the point of aim, tearing through aluminum skin, smashing into the engine, shredding hydraulic lines. The Judy nosed over sharply and plunged toward the ocean. 5 confirmed kills. Vraciu didn't pause. His training had prepared him for exactly this scenario. Multiple targets, limited ammunition, maximum efficiency required, no wasted shots. Every burst had to count. He pulled up slightly, rolled right, and acquired another Judy. This one was attempting to evade, jinking left and right. Vraciu anticipated the maneuver, led the target, and fired a 2-second burst. The bomber's right wing folded upward and tore away. The aircraft tumbled out of control. 6. His wingman called out a warning over the radio. Zeros diving from above, attempting to protect the bombers. Vraciu looked up and saw 3 fighters in a steep dive, cannon fire flickering from their wings. He rolled inverted and pulled through, using the Hellcat's superior power to execute a split-S maneuver that reversed his direction and built tremendous speed. The Zeros couldn't follow. Their lighter wing loading and less powerful engines meant they couldn't match his dive speed without risking structural failure. Vraciu came out of the maneuver 3,000 feet below his starting altitude, traveling at over 450 miles per hour, and found himself perfectly positioned behind another Judy attempting to reach launching range. The Japanese pilot saw him coming and pushed his aircraft into a desperate dive toward the wave tops. At 50 feet above the ocean, the bomber leveled out and attempted to escape at high speed. Vraciu followed effortlessly. The Hellcat's speed advantage was overwhelming. He closed to 150 yards, centered his gun sight carefully, and fired a short burst. The bomber's left engine exploded. The aircraft cartwheeled across the water's surface in a spray of foam and debris. 7. Vraciu pulled up hard, climbing back to altitude. His ammunition counter showed he had fired approximately 1,800 rounds. He had perhaps 400 rounds remaining, distributed across 6 guns. Less than 1 minute of firing time at full rate. He needed to make every shot count. Another Judy appeared ahead, flying straight and level. The pilot apparently hadn't seen him yet. Vraciu approached from dead astern, the most advantageous position. At 200 yards, he fired a carefully controlled burst of approximately 3 seconds. The bomber exploded in a brilliant fireball that forced Vraciu to roll right sharply to avoid flying through the debris. 8. The Japanese formation was disintegrating rapidly under the concentrated attacks by multiple Hellcat divisions that had now joined the engagement. Bombers were falling from the sky in all directions. Zeros were desperately trying to defend but were outnumbered and outclassed. The sky was filled with smoke trails marking the paths of dying aircraft. Vraciu spotted one final target. A Judy flying alone, separated from the formation, heading desperately toward the carriers at maximum speed. This bomber had to be stopped. If it reached launching range and released its bomb, it could damage or sink a carrier, despite the odds against it penetrating the defensive screen. He advanced his throttle to war emergency power, overriding the normal limits and accepting accelerated engine wear for maximum performance. The Pratt & Whitney responded with a surge of power that pressed him back into his seat. The Hellcat accelerated rapidly, closing the distance. At 300 yards, he opened fire with his remaining ammunition. Tracers walked across the bomber's fuselage. The aircraft shuddered under multiple impacts but continued flying. Vraciu held the trigger down, expending his final rounds in one sustained burst. The bomber's fuel tanks exploded. The aircraft disintegrated in mid-air. 9. His guns were empty, all 2,400 rounds expended. 9 Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single engagement that had lasted perhaps 15 minutes from first contact to final shot. Vraciu keyed his microphone and reported to the fighter director, Winchester. Returning to base, Lieutenant Commander Bowie acknowledged, "Well done, Alex. That's some damn fine shooting. Get back aboard and rearm." The remainder of his division formed up on his wing as they turned toward the task force. Below, the ocean was dotted with oil slicks and floating debris marking where Japanese aircraft had crashed. The destruction was comprehensive and absolute. As Vraciu approached USS Lexington for landing, the air operations officer reported the preliminary results over the radio. The engagement had been catastrophic for the Japanese. Of approximately 50 aircraft in this particular raid element, fewer than 5 had escaped to return to their carriers. American losses were 2 Hellcats damaged. Both pilots recovered safely. Vraciu trapped aboard Lexington at 1500 hours. His aircraft had taken no damage whatsoever, despite engaging 9 enemy aircraft at close range. As he climbed out of the cockpit, his plane captain examined the wings and found the gun barrels were discolored from heat but otherwise undamaged. The aircraft was ready to fly again as soon as armament crews reloaded the ammunition bays. Commander Paul Bowie met Vraciu on the flight deck with a broad smile. 9 confirmed, Alex. That's a new squadron record. Hell, that might be a Navy record for single engagement. Vraciu removed his flight helmet and wiped sweat from his face. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by exhaustion. I just kept shooting until my guns went empty. There were so many targets. It was like they didn't know how to fight against Hellcats. That observation, spoken casually by an exhausted pilot on a carrier flight deck, captured the essential truth of what had occurred. The Japanese genuinely didn't know how to fight effectively against Hellcats. Their doctrine, their tactics, their training, everything was optimized for air combat, as it had existed in 1942. Against Wildcats with inferior performance, Zero tactics worked reasonably well. Against Hellcats with overwhelming advantages in protection, firepower, and speed, those same tactics were suicidal. The full scope of the disaster became apparent to Japanese commanders only gradually, as surviving aircraft straggled back to their carriers throughout the afternoon and evening. Admiral Ozawa had launched 326 aircraft in 4 major raids. Only 130 returned, 196 aircraft lost, approximately 60% casualties in a single day. Aboard the Japanese carrier Taiho, the atmosphere was one of shocked disbelief. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, a Zero pilot who had survived 3 combat missions that day, sat in the ready room with the other survivors and tried to process what had happened. He had fought Americans before. He had shot down Wildcats over the Solomons in 1943. He understood American tactics and had respected their courage even while consistently defeating them. But this was different. The blue fighters they faced today, the ones the Americans called Hellcats, fought with a systematic brutality that was terrifying. They were faster, much faster. When a Hellcat wanted to disengage, it simply dove away or climbed away, and there was nothing a Zero could do to prevent it. The superior power was overwhelming. They were more heavily armed. The 650 caliber machine guns produced a rate of fire that destroyed Zeros with single bursts. Abe had watched a squadron mate's aircraft literally disintegrate under a 2-second burst from a Hellcat. The thin aluminum skin that made the Zero so maneuverable offered no protection whatsoever against that devastating firepower. They were better protected. Abe had achieved good firing solutions on several Hellcats during the day's engagements. He had seen his 20mm cannon rounds strike their targets clearly. The Hellcats absorbed the hits and continued fighting. One Hellcat he engaged had taken at least 5 cannon strikes that he witnessed personally. It flew home to its carrier. A Zero taking 5 cannon strikes would have exploded. Most disturbing was the American tactical discipline. They never attempted to turn with Zeros at low speed where Japanese maneuverability provided advantage. Never. Not once. They maintained high speed constantly. They attacked from altitude. They fired and disengaged before Japanese pilots could react. They worked in pairs that protected each other perfectly. Abe reported his observations to his squadron commander, who listened with increasingly grim expression. The commander had flown in the second raid and barely survived after his Zero was severely damaged by a Hellcat's 6-gun burst. "How many Hellcats were shot down today?" Abe asked. The commander consulted the preliminary reports. Across all 4 raids, Japanese pilots claimed approximately 100 American fighters destroyed, but photo reconnaissance of the American task force showed no carriers damaged or sunk. The actual American losses were probably fewer than 30 fighters for the entire day. Against Japanese losses of nearly 200 aircraft, a kill ratio of approximately 7-1 in America's favor. The commander looked at Abe directly. "This is a disaster. We cannot continue operations against such opposition. The American fighters are simply superior." That admission, spoken quietly in a carrier-ready room, represented a fundamental shift in Japanese naval aviation's understanding of reality. For 2.5 years, Japanese pilots had believed their training, their experience, their aircraft, and their spirit gave them advantage over Americans. Today's engagement had shattered it beyond any possibility of reconstruction. The mystique was dead. The Hellcat had killed it as surely as it had killed 196 Japanese aircraft. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate battle. Admiral Ozawa withdrew his mobile fleet westward during the night, conceding control of the Philippine Sea to American forces. The invasion of Saipan continued without Japanese air interference. By July 9th, Saipan was secured. Tinian and Guam followed. The Marianas were now in American hands, providing bases for B-29 superfortresses that would systematically destroy Japanese cities over the following year. Alexander Vraciu continued flying combat missions throughout the remainder of the campaign. His final score reached 19, confirmed aerial victories, making him the Navy's 4th highest scoring ace. In December 1944, while strafing ground targets in the Philippines, his aircraft was hit by ground fire. He ditched in Manila Bay and was captured by Japanese forces. He spent the remaining months of the war as a prisoner. The conditions were harsh, food was scarce, medical care was non-existent. Many prisoners died from malnutrition, disease, or execution. Vraciu survived through physical resilience, mental toughness, and luck. American forces liberated his camp in February 1945. He returned home weighing 40 pounds less than his capture weight. The F-6F Hellcat's combat record was unprecedented. Navy and Marine Corps pilots flying Hellcats destroyed 5,156 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. Hellcat losses totaled 270 aircraft, producing an overall kill ratio of 19-1. No other fighter aircraft in history achieved comparable results. The Hellcat wasn't the fastest fighter or the most maneuverable. What made it supreme was the combination of capabilities optimized specifically for carrier operations against Japanese aircraft. Sufficient speed to control engagements, sufficient firepower to destroy targets quickly, sufficient protection to survive battle damage, sufficient reliability for carrier operations. Roy Grumman's design team had created the optimal fighter for the specific mission of destroying Japanese aircraft while operating from carriers in the Pacific. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which Americans remember as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, represented the decisive end of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. After June 19th, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy never again mounted a major carrier air operation. The carriers that survived were used primarily as decoys in subsequent battles, their flight decks nearly empty of aircraft and pilots. By early 1945, Japanese naval aviation existed primarily to provide kamikaze aircraft. Conventional combat operations had proven futile against American numerical and technical superiority. Suicide attacks, while horrifying and occasionally effective, couldn't change strategic outcomes. American forces continued advancing toward Japan regardless of casualties. Alexander Vraciu survived the war and enjoyed a long career. He remained in the Navy, eventually commanding fighter squadrons and retiring as a commander in 1963. He participated actively in veteran organizations, speaking at events about his experiences. In interviews late in his life, he consistently emphasized that his success was due to excellent training, superior aircraft, and good fortune more than individual skill. On January 29, 2015, Alexander Vraciu died at his home in California. He was 96 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His headstone lists his rank and decorations, but doesn't mention the 9 aircraft he destroyed in a single engagement. That information lives in official Navy records, in squadron histories, in the memory of what American pilots achieved when they finally had the tools to win. On June 19, 1944, when Alexander Vraciu destroyed 9 Japanese aircraft in 15 minutes, he demonstrated what superior aircraft, superior tactics, and superior training could achieve. His victory wasn't superhuman ability or luck. It was the inevitable result of systematic advantages that the United States had developed through careful analysis and massive resource investment. The Japanese pilots he fought were brave men fighting with desperate courage, but courage alone couldn't overcome fundamental disadvantages in aircraft performance, tactical doctrine, and pilot training. The Hellcat represented all of those American advantages in a single package. It was the right aircraft at the right time against an opponent who had been systematically studied and understood. The Japanese never underestimated the Hellcat again after that day. They couldn't afford that luxury. Surviving pilots understood exactly what they faced. Superior speed allowing Americans to control every engagement. Superior protection allowing survival of hits that would destroy Japanese aircraft. Superior firepower destroying targets with single bursts. Superior numbers meaning every battle occurred on American terms. Against such overwhelming advantages, defeat was inevitable. The only question was how long Japanese pilots would continue fighting a war they knew they couldn't win. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.